Hello, welcome back to my channel, and this is Crew at Psychology. In this video, we'll be looking at the working memory model for the model answer in AQA Psychology A-level syllabus. So the question is outline and evaluate the working memory model. Simply just that. And as usual, we'll begin with AO1 and then AO3. AO1 for 6 marks and AO3 for 10 marks. And we'll be looking at the details we all need to gain full marks. Okay. The working memory model was proposed by Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch in 1974. We don't need the full name. We don't need the year. I'm just putting it in to have like the details as an alternative to the multi-store model of memory. Again, we don't need to mention multi-store model here because this question is on working memory. Okay, then the main bit actually starts here. The working memory model focuses on short-term memory because it argues that short-term memory is not a single unitary store. I'm just avoiding to use the word it or not to use the word it. So being specific that this is about referring working memory to the idea of short-term memory, but an active system consisting of different components responsible for processing and temporarily storing information. The model originally consisted of 3 components: the central executive, the phonological loop, and the visual spatial sketchpad. In 2000, again, we don't need the year, but it's the idea that Baddeley later added a 4th component called the episodic buffer. Then after this introduction, which we sort of like don't need it to be this long, we want to talk about the different components, about what they are and the details that are essential to gain full marks. The central executive, we begin with this, is the main attentional control system. It directs attention and coordinates the activities of other slave systems. It also allocates processing resources to different tasks. The central executive has a very limited capacity and is thought to be modulity-free, meaning it can process information from different sensory modalities. So this is all what we need. This is essential to have in our model answer or in our real exam answer. We need to say that the central executive has a limited capacity. It is modulity-free, meaning like it can process all sorts of information regardless of being like visual, acoustic, semantic, but it's just the idea of using this keyword that we learned in the syllabus to apply it to like central executive. The rest is like that it processes information in different sensory modalities. It's the idea of like defining the keyword we put in. So whatever key term that we use in our model answer, don't forget to define what it is, because the examiner would be thinking that if you don't put it in, this student doesn't know what it means. It's just like memorizing the word and putting that word in the answer. So we want to define any key term that is a key term as well. Okay, then the phonological loop processes auditory information. It is divided into 2 subcomponents, the phonological store and the articulatory rehearsal process. So we want the names in here, the subcomponents in here, and refer to what they are. The phonological store holds spoken words that are heard, sometimes called the inner ear. It has like this synonym in it, so we want to refer to it as the inner ear as well, while the articulatory rehearsal process, known as the inner voice, allows information to be repeated and maintained through subvocal rehearsal. Without rehearsal, information in the phonological loop decays after approximately 2 seconds. We want detail, we need the words in, and that's okay to gain full marks in this section on phonological loop. And then we have the visual spatial sketchpad, that it stores and processes visual and spatial information. Give examples such as shapes, colors, or movement. It is sometimes referred to as the inner eye. I mean, in this section, we have like the visual part and the spatial part. We want to talk about each of these separately. So we can sometimes refer to the visual spatial sketchpad as the inner eye. Then it says evidence suggests it can be subdivided into a visual catch, which stores visual form and color. Basically, this is just the visual part of this store. And the inner scribe, which processes spatial and movement information. I mean, this is the spatial part of this visual spatial sketchpad. And apart from saying that these are the names, these are the parts, there's really nothing else. Like, I mean, there's really nothing else to like have it mentioned in this paragraph too. So this is all okay for this paragraph. Then we still have the episodic buffer. The episodic buffer was later added to the model to integrate information from different components and link working memory with long-term memory. It is considered a temporary store. I mean, all of these are temporary store. We can mention that as well if these look too short, but I don't think they look too short. I mean, it's already mentioned at the very beginning that it's temporary. I mean, it's a temporary store, saying that it's temporarily storing information. But then the main bit to mention would be central executive because that connects with all of the other parts of the working memory since it's central, it's in the center. So as long as we already mentioned this in central executive and in the beginning of our model answer or in our real answer, I suppose we don't need to have it fully mentioned like in all of the paragraphs, but like it's just like me saying it again in the episodic buffer. It is also considered or it is considered a temporary store because it's added like later or later added to the model, right? So I want to make sure that this is also one of the key components of working memory too. Then with limited capacity that combines visual, spatial, and acoustic information. So this is the idea of the episodic buffer being like linked to all of the other components of working memory. So that's why it can process all like visual, spatial, acoustic information into a coherent sequence, providing additional storage for the other slave systems. So apart from saying that it connects to long-term memory, talking about like the data that it processes all of these types of information, it also acts as like an additional temporary storage. Whenever like information is full in one of the components, like say phonological loop uses all of its cognitive resources, the storage is already full there. This provides additional storage for acoustic information that's full in phonological loop, for example. Okay, then now AO1 is perfect. I don't think there are anything else because the question is evaluate the working memory model. It's not evaluate research into working memory model. So I mean, if you want to use evidence like the key studies like Badley et al., Badley and Hitch, that own studies in AO1, I mean, you can do that, but you would like ideally use that more in AO3 for this question. But in questions like evaluate research into working memory model, you would ideally put that since AO1. So read the question carefully always. I'm not saying this is like perfect, like 16 out of 16, but just a guide for students, for teachers to use in teaching, to use in revision, right? And see what else we need to have in like AO3. One strength. So I picked the best strength, I believe, and the best weaknesses, I believe, would be perfect for a model answer, as most schools would probably teach badly. Most students would probably be familiar with the study, or at least something on dual task experiments and KF case study for strength. And weaknesses, we'll look at that later once we've looked at strength. So let's look at AO3 now. One strength of the working memory model is that there is strong experimental evidence supporting separate short-term components. I mean, it would be not always needed, not always necessary to say working memory. I use the word short-term memory to make it easier to understand when we revise, when we look at example model answers. But in a real exam, I mean, it's pretty much fair enough to use the word short-term memory, but it might be better to stick with the word working memory instead. I mean, both is correct. It's just the wording that the examiner prefers. Maybe like working memory, that might be more suitable for this question, but nothing wrong with referring to short-term memory. So, okay, there's evidence supporting separate short-term memory components. What that means is that the visual spatial sketchpad, for example, is separate, it's different. It's not linked to phonological loop. So by understanding that concept, which sort of evidence supports that, those task experiments support that, so we want to refer to them. Badly conducted those task experiments, say if you can't remember the name badly, you can just simply say, supporting study conducted those task experiment and found that da-da-da-da-da. We want to talk about what they do in their research, what they did in their research, right? So in which participants performed two tasks simultaneously. The idea of dual means two, and we want to say that they performed them simultaneously or at the same time. So participants found it more difficult to carry out two visual tasks together. Just give examples of what tasks than one visual task and one verbal task at the same time. It's the same idea as saying like they can do different tasks at the same time, but like find it more difficult to perform like two verbal tasks together. I mean, as long as you gave an example, that's fine, but it's good to be clear on both sides. One side on like doing two tasks with the same, using the same component, such as phonological loop here at the same time would be more difficult than doing two tasks that one requires phonological loop and the other requires visual spatial sketchpad at the same time. So this here would be much easier, but we need to still explain that. This suggests that verbal and visual information are processed by separate systems with independent capacities. We don't need to, I mean, if you have time, you can say that the visual task uses Visual Spatial Sketchpad. It's just a different way of writing, but the idea is the same. The explanation is the same. And for verbal tasks that requires or uses phonological loop, again, you can write in that way, or you can write it in this way. But we need to say that like it shows that the two tasks here uses separate systems, uses different systems. Either you like say this, or you spell out what those systems are, what those components are, and say that they're independent or they're separate from each other. Then the linked sentence. This supports the working memory model because it demonstrates that short-term memory is not a single unitary store, increasing the validity of the model. So this suggests like the model is correct. The validity phrase here, some students would probably say like, this is a methodological issue. And I'm saying, yeah, it is. But in this sentence, we're saying that the model is valid, being the idea that the model is correct. So we're not evaluating any research here. It's fine to use the word validity in the linked sentence like this. If not, you can just simply say supporting like working memory, but it's always good to refer back to like why that is the case, because like short-term memory is not a single unitary store. Just like have that in as well. It would be better than leaving it out short and saying like, this supports the working memory full stop, model full stop. That would be not enough for like a perfect link sentence, right? Then another strength, I use a different study this time. I use the idea of a case study, and we only have one popular case study being KF here. It's different to the multi-store model because that one, look back in the model, in the multi-store model video I made, but for working memory model, we want to be clear that it's like referring to phonological loop, Visual Spatial Sketchpad. So KF is definitely one of the good examples here because he suffered from like a brain damage. So first of all, say another strength comes from clinical case study evidence. Then KF was a patient who suffered brain damage following a motorcycle accident. So just like outline a little bit what happened to him, maybe not like essential to go into detail, like which year and what motorcycle brand, like we don't need all of those details. I'm just saying it's a motorcycle accident is fine. Then KF had severely impaired verbal short-term memory. I mean, it's good to like be very, very clear in saying that it's verbal. If you just say it's phonological loop, I mean, that's also fine too. But relatively intact visual short-term memory, or say it's visual spatial sketchpad, according to multi-store model. So why did I refer it back to the multi-store model? Because we want to say that like damage to short-term memory should affect all short-term memory processing equally if it's in multi-store model, because that's a unitary store, right? But here, because short-term memory is viewed as one store, here, however, KF's performance suggests that short-term memory contains separate components for different types of information. So the previous sentence on multi-store model isn't AO1, it's part of the evaluation, and that's why we have it in here too. So I remembered earlier I said that we don't actually need to refer to multi-store model. I mean, that's in AO1. I mean, we can have it to say like short-term memory or long-term memory is not a unitary store, like how it's claimed in multi-store model. But that's just like that sentence. We don't need more than that on multi-store model in this question on working memory model. In this sentence, it's a different idea. It's just like the idea that in KF, it's a different case where short-term memory contains separate components of different types of information. And since we already highlighted how have it in like the sentence earlier in this paragraph to say that KF had damaged phonological loop, but normal visual spatial sketchpad, that's fine. That's perfect. We don't need to refer to phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad again. Then the link sentence. This provides support for the working memory model because it demonstrates the existence of independent subsystems within working memory. So rather than short-term, long-term memory being distinct, being independent from one another, this time it's within the short-term memory being the working memory that is distinct from one another. And being clear somewhere earlier or somewhere in this paragraph that we're referring to phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad being different, being independent from each other. Okay, perfect for strength. Then for weakness, I believe, okay, there are a couple of weaknesses. And I mean, usually for strength, we can have like, if it's a theory or model or an explanation, we can have a supporting study, but in some topics that don't have supporting studies to use, we can stick with practical applications. I didn't have that because most schools teach KF, most schools teach something about dual task experiments. This is more specific to working memory. So I want to include something that's specific to each topic. That's why I picked both of these. Apart from these, if you can't remember either like KF or like evidence in a real exam, think of how the model is useful. Think of how a theory can be applied to real life, something like that. But I have it in brackets at the end. We might look at that. We can look at that at the end. I'll look at it at the end. For weakness, however, if we have like supporting studies in our strength, it's just only if we have them, we can evaluate those pieces of evidence. For example, saying like KF is like a case study, so it lacks generalizability, but that's not enough. We need to link it back to the model to say like working memory model is not representative to like everyone's memory in not in real life. That's generalizability. It's just like not representative to like the majority in the population because KF is distinct. He's like from a case study, so he's unique to like others. So that's how we go about like evaluating the research first. So not research full stop and that's it, the research first. And then we need to link back to like the topic, like the theory, the model, or the explanation. That's an easy way to go about evaluating the weakness. If you can't remember weaknesses of the specific topic, if you can, it would be more specific to working memory, such as how the central executive lacks clarity here. So I just gave an example of like KF lacking generalizability. Apart from that, these experiments are lab experiments. We can say that they lack mundane realism or ecological validity. Depends on the word your school had taught, right? And that isn't enough. We can't just have that. We need to link it back to the model and say like it's not representative. The model isn't representative to explaining real life memory processes. Something like that would be ideal. Then, okay, let's look at the example I have. I have one that is like very specific to working memory model, which is the idea that, however, one limitation is that the central executive lacks clarity. But Lee himself acknowledged that the central executive is poorly understood and difficult to measure scientifically. So that's the first point, is that it lacks clarity in the weakness, then have like a little bit to explain, then elaborate that. I mean, usually I say like in PO paragraphs, we have evidence. If we don't have evidence, we have examples. In this paragraph, the example is examples and explain can be written together as long as it's like very clear. It can allow that paragraph to gain full marks. Okay, so this is one of the difficult versions of writing a PO structure because most of the time we have evidence or most of the time we have example, but for some weaknesses or for some strength, but usually it's weaknesses rather than strength, you have examples and explain together. Okay, at the same time. So the example would be referring to central executive, saying that it's poorly understood, difficult to measure scientifically, it's not like clearly explained, etc., etc. I mean, in the textbook, they probably have something like shorter than this, and you probably like, or most students probably like don't know how to go about explaining and gaining full marks for this point. And it might be better to use other points in that situation. But in this model answer, I'm just showing how to like explain something, which is an abstract concept, to make it very clear, to make it enough to be ideal for this paragraph to gain full marks. So apart from saying it's like poorly understood, difficult to measure scientifically, I mean, it's not repeating the sentence that was already written. Think about how you would put this in other words. In other words, what is meant by like poorly understood or not measured scientifically? It's not clearly explained. That's how we're going to write this. The model does not clearly explain how the central executive allocates attention, like not clearly explained in terms of what, like we need to like always be questioning ourselves about how to elaborate on what was already written so that the sentence or the paragraph isn't too short. I'm not saying like longer paragraphs are better and shorter paragraphs are worse. Not always the case. Some short paragraphs are okay to gain full marks. Not always the case, but like in this situation, like not clearly explained in terms of what, in terms of how it allocates attention or controls the slave systems. So think back to AO1 whenever you encounter any topics you're writing about in AO3 and you're stuck. Think about what it is first. Think about what it does next. Then explain. Some psychologists argue that the central executive may consist of several subcomponents or several separate components rather than a single system. I mean, this is one of the points in the textbook, in one of the textbooks actually. But if you don't study this idea, think of like the model that like other components in working memory, they're all divided into subcomponents, but this central executive alone isn't. So maybe it probably should be divided into other components as well. So, I mean, you can use this idea. Think about AO1 and apply some idea from AO1 across as a strength or as a weakness, mainly weaknesses more than strength in your answer. And up to the point where there's really nothing else to write, then just finish the paragraph with a linked sentence. This reduces the explanatory power of the working memory model because an important part of the model remains vague and incomplete. Okay, so I hope it somewhat helps. I know it's hard to write something like this, but like practice, keep looking at enough model answers to gain enough ideas on like what like is required to gain full marks in terms of the explain part of the PO structure. Or sometimes that examples go together with explain, so we need like a very clearly detailed explanation enough, like not just like one sentence. Try at least having like 2 sentences in explaining something and see if like there's more that you can write to that. If yes, then write. If no, then just like link. Yeah, and that's probably like the best version and gain feedback and improve from that. Another weakness. So I don't see there's any other weaknesses. So look back to the supporting study. We had like KF study and the dual task experiments. Just pick one that you believe like can be used. I mean, both can be used, but like just pick one that you can clearly explain, like in the exam situation, like is it like more familiar to you for using like ecological validity or generalizability? I mean, there's also a better one to go with. So just saying like if some students say KFK study lacks generalizability, the examiner might argue like do task experiments don't. So actually, we can't really say that the working memory model is not representative to majority in the population because dual task experiments use many participants. I mean, the examiners might not be that strict as long as whatever supporting study you put in, you evaluated it well, clear, detailed, and made sure that you link it back to the topic on some model theory or explanation. If you did that, then that's okay to gain like a high mark. I say a high mark, but maybe not like a top like 16 out of 16 because examiners might still argue that it's not like the best ones to go with. I mean, to gain 16 out of 16, I'm saying it's like it's hard. Like you can plan, right? Before you go into the real exam, you can plan like which strength weaknesses are best to use, and you can rehearse them over and over again to know like what exactly to write with these questions. But like that there's like better ones and worse ones, but you can still gain a high mark to use generalizability. What about saying ecological validity? I mean, KF is in a real life setting, so should like working memory model like represent real life? If we say that they don't represent real life, can that like still gain full marks? I mean, KF is only one person, which is like the weight of evidence is not as strong as an experiment containing like many participants. So I stick with like saying that the working memory model came from or is supported by lab experiments or laboratory studies, and that it lacks mundane realism or lacks ecological or external validity. I stick with this instead because you know the weight of evidence. I mean, this is what really like at A level they don't like think about too much. As long as it's clear, you can still gain like the top band, as I said many times. I tend to repeat myself a lot, but like at university, they do think about this more seriously. Yeah, seriously, because they're like, okay, is this fully argued? Is this fully explained? Like, if it is good to an extent, but not perfect, not even to get like the top band, you need to like be more selective and it at university, not in A level. Yeah, be more selective at university and like choosing the best ones that you like genuinely like think it couldn't be counter argued. I mean, almost anything, everything can be argued against, but like it's the best one to go with already. That's what you select at university. Okay, I'm not stressing anyone out here. I'm just sharing my experience studying and teaching psychology. So now look at this paragraph. Another weakness is that much of the evidence supporting the working memory model comes from highly controlled laboratory studies using artificial tasks, leading to poor mundane realism, such as, so we want to be specific to what is actually tested or done in these studies, such as recalling digits or tracking shapes. These tasks may not reflect how working memory operates in real life situations. We want to be specific about our wording. So say working memory. We need this word in our answer. If we just say that like the supporting study lacks ecological validity, so something like so it cannot represent real life. Try not to use the word it. Like be specific, refer back to like the topic in the question, working memory. Very simple here. Meaning the findings may have low ecological validity. As a result, the model may oversimplify the complexity of everyday memory processes, right? Have the word memory in our answer too, because this is the topic that we're writing about. So that's okay. We don't need to like be specific and say like it's badly studied. I mean, other studies that use dual tasks that conducted dual task experiments that use dual tasks are in the same situation. So instead of being just like on badly, or if we use KF, then we need to refer to KF because that's a case study. But okay, apart from experiments like badly, we can just like write like in general, like most research comes from laboratory studies and that because it's most research came from here, then the model isn't that representative to explain real life or everyday memory processes. Okay, as promised, we'll look at practical applications just as an example too in this video. In other videos, I select like the actual best strength and weaknesses to use, and I tend to go with 2-2. So 2 strength, 2 weaknesses. You can go with 1-3 or 3-1 strength versus weaknesses. It depends in the real exam, what came up, what popped up in your head. Write that so you don't waste time. As long as it's something that you can explain well, use that. It's not university level. You don't need to be like super selective, but you can be super selective if you have time. Everything is down to time. So let's see how we can write practical applications for topics that like, we usually don't think about in everyday life. It's like very abstract, something on like a theory or model. A further strength is that the working memory model has practical applications in understanding learning difficulties. For practical applications, it doesn't necessarily have to come from textbook. It's just something that you think it's logical, it makes sense that this model or this theory or this explanation can like explain something in real life and can be used to practically achieve, to improve something and make a quality of life better in some aspect. Right, so just think of how useful something is. Research has shown that individuals with poor working memory often struggle with tasks such as reading comprehension and problem solving. The model has therefore contributed to educational psychology and strategies to support learning. So I went with this because the idea of knowing that how working memory works, how short-term memory works, it would be useful for things like memory, like in real life. So think of those examples: education, learning, maybe at work, maybe like in offices to not forget stuff, have like memory aid or something about education on revision, anything about memory. But just try to go with like an example and not go into like many different, too much examples. We want to explain, we don't want to like have like many ideas and not well explained, because this is the UK curriculum. If it's the US curriculum or some other curriculums, that will be different. Okay, so this increases the usefulness of the working memory model because it can be applied to real world educational contexts. Okay, use the word real life, useful, practical, have example, explain that example. I mean, this doesn't like look too long. I mean, is it too short? It's like, it sounds short, but it's not too short. It's just okay to use. It can be strengthened or lengthened as well. But I just like want you guys to see a simple example of how to write something about practical applications. In other videos, depends on the topic. If there is not a lot of like supporting studies to use, in some of them, I use practical applications. But okay, this is pretty much it for the working memory model answer. So I hope this video is useful, and I hope to see you again in other videos. All right, bye. Good luck.